All right. Good morning. Everybody doing well this morning? Good looking group. Tell that person next to you, I think he's talking to you. All right. Hey, well, we started a brand new series last week called Life on Mission. And last week we saw that to live that life on mission that Jesus has for you, we need to connect with those people that God has placed in our life. And so we talked about how to do that practically last week and just kind of give you just a short overview. If you missed it, you can always go to our website and watch the sermon on there. But the first thing we talked about is do not underestimate your influence. And we talked about how friends influence friends. And for the most part, people are not reached by strangers, and they won't be reached by television evangelists. They won't be reached by Christian radio, and we're not throwing them under the bus. There's nothing wrong with having a great teaching that you can watch on TV or listen to positive music on the radio. But we did a survey last week, and we asked people how many people actually came to the Lord through a TV evangelist. Nobody raised their hand. This is over 3 services, well over 500 people. We asked, well, how many people was reached by Christian radio? I think we had 1 or 2, which really drives home the point that friends reach friends. And this is a pattern that we find in the New Testament, and this is a pattern that God really expects us to walk out in our own culture. And so we need to not underestimate the influence, the network of people that God has placed in our life. And the second thing we talked about last week is we need God's compassion. And we looked at the life of Jesus, and we saw how lost people that are far from God, did not run from Jesus, but they actually ran to Jesus. And we looked at one passage last week where they ran to him and really wanted to listen to what he had to say. And when you look at Jesus and his message, it certainly wasn't because Jesus kind of watered the message down and kind of was trying to tickle people's ears. It wasn't because Jesus compromised on sin and said, that everything you're doing is fine and acceptable. But we talked about how Jesus disarms people with his compassion. Jesus loved people and showed that love with a spirit of compassion and not a condemning spirit. Actually, Jesus was a friend to sinners, friend to people that were far from God. He wasn't a foe. And then we talked about to reach lost people, we need to really take effort and initiative. And we talked about in many of our Christian lives and even in church life, many times we do just the opposite. We're tending to wait for the lost to come to us. And we're tempted to be passive rather than active. And we're waiting for people to come to Christ rather than bringing people to Christ. And the challenge that we challenged you with last week, the action step was to fill out a card, and the card is in your bulletin this morning if you weren't here last week. And we asked you to identify 3 families or 3 people that God has placed on your heart to intentionally pray for between now and Easter. And at some point between now and Easter, ask God for the right opportunity to invite them to one of our Easter services. And we talked last week how 90% of people, they did a study years ago, 90% of people would go to an Easter service if somebody simply invited them. So church, we need to invite people if we want to make an impact with our friends in that. And so if you haven't filled that card out, fill it out, put it in the offering plate at the end of the service. Well, today I want to talk about winning the right to be heard. And if we're going to share what Jesus Christ has done in our lives with others, we've got to live in such a fashion that we really kind of earn the right to be heard. And to do that, we need to keep it real. In other words, we need to live authentic lives. And a dictionary defines authenticity as conforming to what is represented or claimed to be. In other words, what you say lines up with what you do. The opposite of authenticity is dishonesty. Claiming to believe one thing, but living, by a different set of standards. And if there's just a take-home point today is this: people watch the way we live. They watch to see if the way we live lines up with our belief system. Paul tells Titus in 2, verse 7 and 8, says, in everything, set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity, seriousness, and soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about you. You know, the way we live our lives are communicating one of two things. The way we live our lives, we're either communicating that our walk with Jesus is a life-changing, life-giving relationship between the creator of the universe that's transforming our lives. Or the way we live our life is that we are part of a meaningless religion, a dead religion that has nothing to offer. You know, there's a story of a woman who pulled up to a red light behind another car, and the driver in the front was texting, so the light turned green, and the guy is in his little texting world, and the lady behind him is you know, beating the steering wheel and begins to blow the horn, and the guy is still in his own little world. So she rolls the window down and starts cussing him out and just laying in on the horn. So the guy kind of wakes up out of his zombiness and realizes it's yellow light. So he guns it and gets through the light. She doesn't get through the light. So she continues with this meltdown, just cursing and shaking her fist at the guy. And all of a sudden she sees she's being pulled over by a cop. And before she knows it, she's actually been arrested. And so after she's spent a couple hours in a jail cell, she's released, and the arresting officer met her at the front desk to give her personal belongings back and said, "Ma'am, I owe you a big apology. But you see, when I pulled up behind you and you were having your meltdown, you were cussing that guy out and making all these obscene gestures, I noticed a Jesus Loves You license plate holder, and I love my church bumper sticker, and a chrome-plated little Christian fish symbol on the back of your car. So naturally, I assumed the car was stolen." But I was wrong. Have a blessed day. You know, for most people know that a faith that is worth living will impact the way you live your life. It'll influence your decisions, your behaviors, your actions. And we need to be reminded, you know, that every day people are watching the way we live our lives. And I heard a teaching just recently by a gentleman by the name of Mark Miller. And he has some great leadership books out there. I just encourage you, if you find one, pick it up. But I was actually watching a YouTube clip of him speaking, and he talked about, and his heart is really for servant leadership. And he took this teaching that God gave him and took it to Africa, and he's just kind of downloading what God has shown him to these African leaders. So after he's done speaking, he's getting ready to walk out the building, and this one guy comes up to him and said, "Mr. Miller, I just want to let you know, you are a man that I can receive from." And I said, "Well, why do you say that?" He said, "Well, before you went to speak, I saw you pour a cup of water, and you handed it to your interpreter. Then you poured another cup of water, and then you gave yourself a drink. But you practiced what you spoke before you got up to speak." He said, "I saw you serve your interpreter first." And what a brilliant, what a great observation. And we need to live a life that convinces people around us that we have the disease, so to speak. And in other words, one person put it this way: Christians are to be good news before they share good news. I want to give you 4 ways that we need to keep it real today. We keep it real by, first off, by doing our very best. You know, Colossians 3:23 says this: "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord." Ecclesiastes 9:10 says, "Whatever your hands finds to do, do it with all your might." And when we do our best, whether it's home or on a job, you know what? People will notice. They'll respect us, and they'll begin to respect our beliefs. And they may not understand it, but they'll look at you and say, "Man, you know, I know that guy's kind of like a Jesus freak, or, you know, just kind of maybe even a religious, you know, fanatic or whatever, but man, he's my best employee. He's the guy that is most honest." You know, if you look in the Old Testament, look at the example of Daniel. Daniel and some of his friends were taken captive by, a enemy of Israel. And they were actually forced into slavery. And so he's actually having to do work. He's actually working. He's forced to work for an ungodly government. And if Daniel hadn't been a competent young man, if he hadn't put his whole heart into what he was given, his assignment was given in that country, we wouldn't be talking about him today. We probably would have never heard about him, no matter how godly of a life that he led. But his integrity in the workplace, because he had a spirit of excellence, it caught the eye of King Nebuchadnezzar. And here's what Scripture says about Daniel and his friends in Daniel 1:20. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Then if you fast forward 70 years later, another king, King Darius, saw the same thing in Daniel. So David never lost that vision, that passion to have a spirit of excellence. It says this in Daniel 6:3. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole nation. And the fact that Daniel's commitment to excellence on the job put him in a position to share his faith with ungodly kings. And it opened the door for him to actually impact an entire empire. And you kind of think about Jesus in the New Testament. Scriptures tell us that he worked as a carpenter. And can you imagine if Jesus cut corners? And tried to, just put out a cheap product. Can you imagine Jesus using particle board rather than real wood to build a table and overcharge his customer? Picture Jesus speaking to a crowd, and in that crowd is a person that he bought a table to that fell apart. And that guy kind of leans over to the guy next to him and said, you know what? This dude has nothing to say to me. He sold me a table that was a piece of junk that fell apart after 2 months. Man, if his work is unreliable, then what he's telling me is unreliable. But that's not the case. Obviously, Jesus had excellent work because he was so well received by people. And I'm not saying that you've got to be the best, but you know what? We've got to do our best. And read another quote I came across. It said, if you want people to pay attention to our faith, we must first pay attention to our work. Before we introduce coworkers to God, we must introduce God into our work. And I hate to say it, over the years, I've been a Christian for many years, I've seen Christians who discredited their testimony because of shoddy work or dishonest work practices. And we need to ask ourselves, do people see God in the way we work? Do my work habits complement or contradict my faith? John Maxwell said this, becoming a person of integrity means deciding to integrate my heart's value into my daily actions. We keep it real also by being courageous. We need to have the courage to stand up for what we believe, even if it's costly. Last year I had a very interesting encounter with somebody that came to the men's group that I'm a part of on Monday night. And he was a friend and a mentor to one of our guys there. And when he introduced himself to me, first thing that came out of his mouth, he said, we have a mutual friend. And he named this guy that I worked with 37 years ago at DeSoto Square Mall when I was a manager up there at a clothing store. And he's now a school principal. I've run across him like one time since I worked at the mall. And this guy that I'm talking to goes on to say, he said, you had a profound effect on his spiritual life. And he went on to say, he said, he told me about the time that you were working and it came down to a situation where you either had to deny your faith or lose your job, and you walked away from your job. And what happened is I was promoted over a person at a clothing store that had been there for a couple years. And when I became manager, I started playing some Christian music, tasteful Christian music. And I would, people would try to sell me drugs back then, and I catch people shoplifting. So I just tell them my testimony and tell them, about Jesus. And this person took that and twisted it and told my area manager that I was preaching to every single person that walked into the store, that I was turning people off, I was getting customers angry and all that. None of that happened, but she was just trying to make me look bad. So my area manager calls me and says, hey, listen, I want you to quit playing Christian music immediately and don't even mention the word Jesus in that store. ever again. Do you understand? I said, well, this is where we part ways. I said, you're asking me to deny my faith. I'm not going to do that. So that was the end of the story. I walked out. And you know what? I'm not trying to pat myself on the back. I didn't do anything that there's not a person here that loves Jesus wouldn't have done in the same situation. Because I know you. You're courageous. But I had no, why I'm sharing that story, I had no idea that there's somebody else was watching. I hired that guy 2 weeks before that happened. I really didn't have a strong relationship with this guy at all. But that guy was watching. And I would have never understood that I had an impact on his life, that he's telling a guy 37 years ago that's getting ready to meet me, say, hey, I know Stan Pavkovich. Man, he helped me understand what it meant to be a disciple. And just to kind of piggyback on what I shared last week is, do not underestimate your influence. Do the right thing no matter what the cost. I'm convinced that we live in a culture, obviously, that is on a moral free-for-all. And I believe that most people understand that. And I believe people are looking for people that have conviction. They understand why they believe what they believe, and there's an anchor in them. And folks, we need to be light in the midst of darkness. Like I said last week, we could either curse the darkness or we can be a light in the midst of darkness. And we need to be compassionate truth tellers. We can't be condemning. We can't think we're better than everybody. But I really believe the world is looking for people of conviction. You know, Jesus set the example for us. If you remember, he continued to maintain that he was the Son of God, that he was the Savior of the world, even when he was being tortured and beaten and crucified. And the Bible tells us that a Roman centurion who witnessed the whole ordeal, after seeing his courage, after seeing Jesus not back down in the midst of torture and being crucified, he didn't back down from the truth. He said, surely this must be the Son of God. And like that centurion, you will make a difference in people's lives by simply doing the right thing no matter what. Now here's the deal. You may not know the effect you have until the next life. I mean, I found out 37 years later that I had an effect on that guy's life. And I just want to encourage you, you do what's right. Here's number 3. Keep it real by being honest with your failures and your sin. You know, people people far from God are not turned off by understanding that we've messed up, that we have a life. And so often, many times people fall into this trap. You know what? I don't need to let people know of the struggles I have or the sins I have or the failures of the past. Somehow, I'm going to turn people off by that. Bill Hybels tells a story in one of his books about a business owner who owned this large company, and he had a significant number of Christians working for him. And at the time, he was not a Christian, but he was leaning in. He was on the edge. And he was watching his Christian employees. And he told Hybels, you know, naturally, I was drawn to God by observing Christian employees and that were conscientious and kind and thorough and aggressive on the job. But I tell you what really impressed me one time. One day, a guy that I knew was a new convert. He said one day this guy who was a new Christian at my plant asked me if he could see me after work. I agreed to see him. Later on in the day, I started to worry about the possibility that this guy, being a real zealot, might come and preach to me. And he said when he came into my office, he surprised me because he came in with his head hanging down. And he said, sir, I'm only going to take a minute, but I'm coming here to ask for your forgiveness. And he said, all the years that I've worked for you, I've done what a lot of other employees do, borrowed a little company product here and there, taken a few extra supplies home. I've abused my telephone privileges, and I've cheated the time clock. But I became a Christian a few months ago, and it's real. It's not smoke and mirrors, it's real. And in gratitude for what Christ has done for me, I want to make amends to you and this company for what I've done wrong over the years. I want to make things right before God and between us. So could we figure out a way to do that? I want to be the first to say, if you need to fire me for what I've done, I deserve it. And I'm not going to make a stink about it. You can let me go. If you want to dock my pay, dock it by whatever figure you think is appropriate. If you want to give me extra work, maybe work overtime to work it off, I'll do that too. But I want to make things right before God and between us. the business owner went on to tell Hybels, he said, that conversation was the single most impressive demonstration of true Christianity he ever witnessed. It had a powerful and positive effect on him, and they worked things out. Hybels goes on to say, but what was it that made that new Christian contagious and impressive? Was it a dazzling 6-minute testimony? Was it a clever new angle on a gospel presentation? No, it was genuine admission of wrongdoing. And he ends with this: authentic confession is powerful witness to the transforming power of Jesus Christ in your life. End of quote. And you know, when you keep it real, when you live the authentic life, it will melt hearts. It will melt walls. It will open up doors. I've seen it in my own life, the power of keeping it real. Because so many people, they have these facades up, and they don't know who to trust. And they're almost used to people lying to them and being dishonest. And it's so refreshing when somebody is real and admit their mistakes, admit when they blow it. So I want to encourage you to keep it real in that area. Then the last point is keeping it real by caring for others. And John's going to come and take this last point. But I want you to watch this video I came across this past week. It's different, but it certainly drives home the point of what we want to see happen on this last point. Thank you.